Hello everyone, and welcome to our second video on YouTube for this class on prophets and prophetic literature. Just want to remind you that all of these videos are completely optional and will not in any way be needed for your assignments or any of the papers that you need to write. Instead, I just want to use this time to talk a little bit about what I didn't get to in class, or questions that are raised, or just other fun supplemental things that I want to sort of bring into the class, but not necessarily use class time to do it. And one of the things I wanted to talk about in this particular video after our introductory course is to think a little bit more about canon and the different ways that prophets and prophetic literature fit into the canon. So if you took in a previous class, an introductory Hebrew class, if you used John Collins' Introduction to the Hebrew Bible book, looks something like this, then on pages 4 and 5 of that volume, he has listed a bunch of different canons: Jewish canon, Protestant canon, Catholic canon. And so you might find that helpful just to review, just to see where the books that we're going to be covering, like Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings, where those books fit in that canon. But if you notice in the Hebrew Bible canon, there are three major divisions: Torah, prophets, which is what we're covering in our course, and writings. And the Torah is the first 5 books, generally traditionally attributed to Moses. In the Protestant canon and in the Catholic canon, oftentimes they're called the Pentateuch, which simply means 5, Pentateuch, so 5 books. In the Jewish canon, the second division is the prophets, and there's the former prophets and the latter prophets, and we're studying both in our course. In the Protestant and Roman Catholic canons, those books are typically called historical books, as we discussed in class, and they also include other books like 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And it's because those books continue the history that has started in Samuel and Kings, continues that history or retells that history again. And so all of those historical books have been grouped together in the Protestant and in the Catholic canons. The final section in the Jewish canon is called the writings, and it contains, it's sort of a catch-all category that contains all sorts of different books like the Psalms, Proverbs, the book of Job, some wisdom books, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Kohelet, a wisdom book, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. All of those books are in the writings section, which probably tells us a little bit about the dating of those books. We have from other books that aren't biblical the phrase the Torah and the prophets, and that phrase occurs in some of those books in the 2nd century BCE, that phrase Torah and prophets. So that lets us know that there was a category in at least the 2nd century BCE, a category called Torah, which would have had the 5 books, and a category called prophets, which would probably had the books that we're studying in our course. And so in the 2nd century, this document has the phrase Torah and prophets sort of used in a shorthand way to mean all of those books. And so that tells us that at that time, either there wasn't a category called the writings, or it was unclear what was contained in that category, or whether or not they were scripture. So there was all sorts of questions sort of swirling around the issue of what is scripture, what makes up the canon, what is acceptable, that sort of things. Another way we could sort of think about the dating of these different categories is that we know that the book of Daniel was written in 164 BCE, or around that time, and that Daniel is placed in the Jewish canon in the writings section, in the 3rd section, which may mean that the prophets category was already closed at that point. So the middle of the 2nd century BCE, 150, 200 years before Jesus, that may mean that prophets category was closed, and Daniel doesn't make it into the prophetic category, but is instead included in the writings section. And then later on, these books are moved around from their original positions within the Jewish canon to make up the Christian canon. The Protestant canon is probably the shortest canon. It includes all the books that are in the Jewish canon in a different order. So they have the exact same books, but they're in a different order. The Catholic canon has additional books. And some of those additional books, for example, are Baruch, and there's some additions to the book of Daniel. There's a book called Wisdom of Solomon and a book called Ecclesiasticus. All of those form additional books that are in the Roman Catholic canon. The Christian Church has always had those in their canon until, obviously, Martin Luther, who went back to the Hebrew canon. And so even though Martin Luther translated these books that we're talking about, he didn't actually consider them part of the canon, the main canon. And so Protestants today have a canon that is exactly like the Jewish canon. It's a shorter canon. I should also point out that the Orthodox Church has an expanded canon that includes some additional books, like First Esdras is part of the Greek Orthodox Church, and there's an additional Psalm 151, and 3rd Maccabees are all included in the Greek Orthodox canon. So every tradition has sort of a different list of what books they consider part of their canon. Why this matters to us in our course is basically Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are in the same place in both the Jewish canon and in the Protestant canon. But it's what comes after it that is significant. In the Jewish canon, you would go straight from Samuel, Kings, to Isaiah, and then Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Whereas in the Protestant canon, you go to, after 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, you go to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Then you have some wisdom and poetry books like Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and then finally at the very end of the Protestant canon is the prophetic section. Some people have explained this as the reason why the prophets are at the end of the Christian canon is because the prophets point most directly to Jesus. And so connection is made stronger between the Old Testament and the New Testament if there is this prophetic literature that's talking about a Messiah at the end, and that leads directly into New Testament. Whereas the Jewish canon has the prophetic literature in the middle of the canon. And so that's the reason why it affects us as we begin to read through some of these books. For the next couple of weeks, talking about Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings, it's not going to make a lot of difference, but when we get into the prophetic literature, it is going to matter somewhat where the prophetic books are in the overall canon. So you should keep that in mind as we read through the books. And of course, as future Christian ministers or educators or whatever, you should also keep in mind the fact that your canon order is slightly different than your Jewish friends and neighbors. That they have the same book in their Bible, in their Hebrew Bible, in their Old Testament, but that they're in a slightly different order. So I just